Well, it's kind of funny because sometimes people have labeled me as the America's greatest purveyor of doom porn. So it's difficult to remain too cheery, but a couple of things. Number one, we are going through a period of extreme change. And yes, that means a lot of dislocation and destruction. But this isn't the end of the human condition. This isn't the end of America or Australia, maybe the end of China. And so we know we will get through this. Our systems are stable. Our demographics are pretty good. Our finances are about as good as you can get. We will get through this. And in the case of the United States, if we're really losing access to materials processing and manufacturing out of both China and Germany at more or less the same time, that means here in North America, we need to double the size of the industrial plant. And yes, that means inflation will be high for a good long time. But it's also going to be the greatest growth story in the history of my country and Mexico and Canada. And on the backside of this, we will have built a supply chain system that uses less workers, is more capital efficient, is more energy efficient, that employs locals to serve local markets, that's cleaner, that's more responsible, and it'll be largely resistant to international shocks. This is a good story. We just have to get from here to there. There are two big things going on. The first is that geopolitics is reasserting itself with a vengeance as the post-Cold War system finally comes to an end. The Americans created the globalized network in order to bribe up an alliance to fight the Soviets, and we've been losing interest in it ever since. And without the networks that support global trade, we don't have global trade. Now, for the Americans, this can be done. We're not a trading country outside of our NAFTA partners. But for everyone else who's built their system on international access to raw materials, energy, and finished goods market, it's a bit of a kiss of death. The second big feature is demographics. As the world globalized, we also industrialized and urbanized. And when you move off the farm and into town, you have fewer kids. You play that forward 75 years, and it's not that we're running out of children. In most of the world, that happened 30, 40 years ago. It's that now we're running out of working-aged adults. So we don't even have an economic model that theoretically can work with the environment that we're about to be in. As the world has aged demographically, capital has been available at greater volumes with greater ease at lower rates than any time in human history, and that pretty much defines the last 15, 20 years. And now the people who generated all that capital, the baby boomers as they were moving towards retirement, are moving into retirement. And so the capital costs were always going to skyrocket about right now and continue rising at least into the mid-2030s. We have 15, 20 years of incredibly cheap capital that we now have to process through. And if you look at just the raw data, the United States is probably okay. We seem to have at least learned most of the lesson from the 2008 financial crisis, but Australia hasn't. Australian credit has risen by a factor of 7 since the year 2000. In the case of India, you're talking about 14. In the case of China, you're talking 34. So the idea that we can kind of let the air out of some of these financial bubbles without them popping is probably a bit of a stretch, but the story is absolutely not going to be the same everywhere. So politically, even if the Ukrainians succeed with this spring offensive in ejecting the Russians from all of their territory, that doesn't stop the war. From the Russian point of view, the war will not end until such time as they have an external crustal defense again, and that's not in Ukraine, that's in Poland and Romania. So for the Russians, Ukraine was always nothing more than the first step, and there's another wave once they're done with Ukraine. But the reverse is true too. Because the Ukrainians know that the Russians will never stop, the Ukrainians, if they're successful, will have to go into Russia and defang its logistic capability so it can't invade. So one way or another, the Russians are either moving into Poland or the Ukrainians are moving to Russia proper. And so we're only at the very beginning of what is going to continue to be a nuclear flashpoint for quite some time. That's piece one. Piece two, without foreign tech and especially foreign workers in the Russian system, their demographic and economic collapse over the last 30 years means that they're having problems maintaining the basic infrastructure that produces a lot of the commodities that the world depends upon. Now, we've all heard the stories of oil, natural gas, and wheat, and I don't mean to suggest none of those are important. They're all important. But the one I'm most concerned about is the variety of fertilizers that the Russian space produces for export, because Russia plus Belarus collectively, they are the world's top supplier of fertilizer as a group. And without them, we cannot support a planet with 8 billion people. Remember that from roughly 2020 until mid-2021, we were having significant whiplashes in demand globally. Every time we got a new variant, every time we got a new vaccine policy, every time something changed, what we consumed, the patterns shifted. And it took about 18 months with each shift for industry to change the manufacturing supply chains to catch up. Well, in the United States, Texas, Arizona, and Florida, they opened up mid-year, and then a few months later, everyone but California followed suit. And then California followed in February of 2022. So yes, those are the dates. Well, we're 18 months past that. So the supply chains have caught up. And so the supply-driven inflation has gone down. That's probably responsible for half of the shift in inflation. The half that hasn't gone away, that's ultimately rooted in labor. Because remember, the baby boomers, the largest generation we've ever had, the largest worker class we've ever had, is now half retired. So the Federal Reserve is using the tool that it has for the problem it understands, but there's a big lag because the sort of demand that is being crunched here is not what has actually driven inflation to this point. If we're going to solve the inflation problem in the long run, we have to fix the supply system. That means training up workers to be more productive. That means a degree of automation, but we have to do that in an environment with more expensive capital, not just because of the Fed, but because of what's going on with the baby boomer retirement. And that's before you consider in disruptions that might happen in places like Germany because of the war, or China because of its demographic collapse. So we've got a lot of headwinds coming that hit the core of what supplies us with goods. And the only way to get around that is produce more goods elsewhere, and that means building more industrial plant, and that is also inflationary. So we should get used to significantly higher inflation for the next several years than we have had in the Western world for the last 40. And it's going to last at least 6 years, maybe as many as 8, and that assumes we get started pretty soon.
Wow, so inflation is going to be sticky for quite some time yet. Now, this is a very interesting question. What do you think the biggest lie is that people have been told by the government? Yeah.
It doesn't matter who's president. The government is always going to do a degree of spin to help people, or to try to get people to not panic. I think to the degree that the governments of the world understand the problem is in some question in my mind. But the biggest concern that I have is we are radically unprepared